Equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI. You've likely heard these words a lot these past few years. And if you're in the job market, you've probably seen a lot of postings from companies and organizations that affirm they are dedicated to them. But what do those words really mean? I'm Joyce Yu, and this is NAIT's Career Essentials podcast. In this episode, I talk to Rondah Worrell-Maik from NAIT's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Office. We talk about how each of us can help foster an inclusive workplace, the tangible benefits of that, and what new grads seeking an equitable workplace should look for while applying for positions.
My name is Rondah Worrell-Maik, and I am an Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Specialist working in the Department of Global Education and Partnerships at NAIT. I've been at NAIT for just over 12 years, but this is a brand new position that I've moved into. So I'm about 4 weeks old in this
That's
new position,
wonderful.
which is really
Mhm.
exciting. So
Yeah.
that's a bit about me. I'm a settler of immigrant parents and was born in Edmonton and have lived here since I was born. So very familiar with Edmonton, familiar with NAIT.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about the work that you're doing with Nate, but I think maybe we'll start off with a little bit more of a general question, which is what makes you passionate about equity, diversity, and inclusion? What draws you to that type of work?
This is something that I've sort of always been interested in, I think, before it had a name, if that makes any sense, before it
Absolutely.
was an initiative in workplaces, feeling a sense of belonging, feeling sort of that tension sometimes in work environments where I didn't feel like I quite fit and didn't fully understand what that meant or what that looked like, even from school age, sort of understanding myself in an environment where I looked different than everyone. I had different family traditions and things like that. So it's definitely always been something that has been part of my existence. I think over the course of, the last maybe 3 4 years, it's been more central to my existence in that I'm trying to understand myself as I went to railroad, so there's a little background to do a leadership master's, and I started to look at being a woman in leadership positions, being a Black woman in leadership positions, and what that looked like and what that meant, and sort of the impacts of all of those things as I was in the workplace. And so that's really where my interest started. And I started to wonder a lot about leadership positions. So having that mirroring that happens where you see someone who looks like you or sounds like you or acts like you in a similar position to where you'd like to be. And I started to realize I didn't see a lot of that. I didn't see a lot of, women of color in senior executive positions in the organizations that I was part of,
Yeah.
and really wanted to understand why that was something that, felt like a light bulb or a trigger or something like that. That was like, oh, why is it like that? What does that mean? And so that's, I think, where my EDI journey sort of started, and wanting
Yeah.
to understand how I fit in the landscape of a lot of organizations and wanting to move up in my career and things like that.
I understand that so much because I think about that a lot where I've been talking about EDI in that phrasing for 6 years now, 7 years now, but I had always experienced it before it had a name in a way in which that I was lacking those opportunities and not really being able to put language behind what my experience was.
Mhm.
And, there was this tweet that I saw, and it just hit me so deeply, and it was, "If you only hire people who have done it before, then you'll miss out on every marginalized person who hasn't gotten promoted because their bosses couldn't picture them doing the job."
Yeah.
And I realized this is what I've been fighting against for a long time, that I didn't even realize that I always just figured, "Oh, I don't have leadership material."
I was just thinking, Joyce, as you were saying that,
Yeah.
I think about often about like limiting voices, and sometimes, the limitations that I place on myself are in my voice, but they're not things that I truly believe about myself. There are things that the environment has influenced, or me not seeing myself as a leader. It's not because I'm not that. or don't have those abilities, but it's the limitations from the external limitations that have now become my internal limitations. I've made them my own, and I that's something that saddens me, and it feels like something I desperately want to change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I realized this very recently that I was thinking back to all of the interviews that I was in, and it was this job at NAIT where it was the first time that I was part of a panel where one of the interviewers was a person of color. And it was the very first time. I didn't realize that I've never experienced that before until I did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
For new grads who are heading into the workforce, what advice would you give them in terms of how each of us can steps that each of us can take to foster an inclusive workplace?
Sort of one of the things for me that has really helped me to understand sort of my positioning and who I am in spaces. We did an intercultural competency exercise as a department, looking at how we viewed other cultures, how we viewed ourselves in circumstances. And so I think that one thing, for me, and what I would encourage grads to do is to start to look internally. So you need to sort of start to determine who you want to be in spaces, how you show up in spaces, understanding yourself. So a lot of internal personal reflection, I think, is necessary, sort of understanding where you are in a dominant position and where you're in a subordinate or marginalized position, and what that means to you. I think that sometimes when you embark on a diversity and inclusion and equity journey, you are looking externally, and you're looking to what's happening out there. But I think that your personal standpoint, your personal stance is something that you need to first take a look at as you start a journey like this and start to want to learn more and understand. And I would emphasize that desire to learn and taking on the personal onus to learn, not expecting others to do that explanation for you, but taking that onus to do research and read resources and listen to podcasts and look at different perspectives. I was saying to my partner recently, he listens to a lot of audiobooks and things like that, and they were all from a certain demographic, and I challenged him to open up his influence to other demographics, to women, to people of color, to people in the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, like open up his understanding. And so I would encourage grads to do that. To I think that when you're in a school environment, you're part of a community, and there's things happening that are, it's a bubble almost. It's a system that you're part of, and sort of opening it up to other systems and things of influence, I think is really important on this journey, at least embarking on it from my experience.
Wonderful. That's great advice. And that's very true about reading things that are outside of your demographic. I saw something recently that said books about people of color are not just for people of color, they're
Mhm.
for everyone. And you can buy books about girls for your boys. You can buy books about people with disabilities for your able-bodied children.
Yeah.
These are for everyone, not only because these groups of people need representation.
Yeah.
Something that I'll admit that I've been cynical about in the past is seeing institutions and companies have their diversity, equity, and inclusion statements
Yeah.
on their companies, on their website, and social media feeds. And I sometimes have a hard time believing it because I don't think that there's actually a genuine commitment to wanting to improve or to learn or to move forward. I think that the goal or the motivation in all of those statements is to not be called out.
Yeah.
And I personally have a hard time with that. And I'm wondering for you, how would you, in terms of someone who may be looking at other companies or new grads who are looking at companies and looking at workforces that who are entering the workforce and trying to align their professional decisions with their values, how do they separate that? How would they separate from is this is this company genuinely committed, or is this just optics?
That's such an interesting question, and I feel like it's something over the last, few weeks of my particular role, looking at the different initiatives and things that NAIT wants to embark on, looking at what other institutions are doing and what they're and if they're doing it well in other organizations and things like that. So I've definitely come across that where it's a statement that's on the front of the website, but then as
Yeah.
you dig through, you don't see any evidence of said diversity and equity and inclusion statement. And so I would say, steps that for an individual who is looking to go out into the workforce and looking at an organization to say, is this somewhere that I want to be? And are underrepresented folks welcome here? And so I think that the thing that I would suggest looking for in organizations is steps beyond just that statement on the front page. Look, and public things that aren't hidden, things that you can find, employee resource groups for different demographics of employees, a training program, something tangible that they can see sort of right at the front when they enter into the application process. If there are statements along the way of an application process that emphasize a desire for implementing equity, diversity, inclusion in the organization, I think that that's something that would stand out for me. Things that other employees might have to say about the organization. I think that sometimes organizations are kind of shrouded in mystery when you when you go to look at things, and I'm often a little bit wary of that. There's a statement on the front page and then there's nothing else. You can't really find anything else. And I understand sort of the, keeping some things as an organization private, but I don't think that those are the things that you keep private. I think that one thing that's becoming more and more clear to me as a person in an organization and as someone in the world, transparency is very important to me in the clothing that I buy and the companies that I support. And so I think that if you're looking to hire people, you are going to put your action on display. You're not going to hide it. And so for a grad looking at an organization, look for those signs that it's a company that would align with their value, with your values, and
Yeah.
that you wouldn't be putting yourself in a position by applying for a job at that organization that would have you in opposition of your values.
Yeah, that's great advice. I've been in situations, not just professionally, but also personally, where people have the privilege to think of EDI as an extracurricular.
Mhm.
And they have best intentions. They have said that they want to learn, but they only have so much time. And there's conflicting priorities in life, in work, and sometimes that will roll into decisions that an organization might make. And because they're slower to be able to get things going in terms of making some type of commitment, making some type of strategy.
It's detrimental to your success as an employee, as a person in the workforce,
Yeah.
to ignore diversity, inclusion, and
Yeah.
equity. It's you. I don't fully understand how anyone would expect to be successful, to go anywhere in their career without taking sort of a step back and recognizing that there is there is privilege, there is dominance, there are all of these things that influence our day to day. And it's not an extracurricular, because you and I cannot decide to not be diverse. We don't get to
Yeah.
we don't get to
Yeah.
wake up in the morning and not have that be our reality. And so I
Mhm.
think that for a person who is too busy or just can't seem to make it a priority, how is that possible? How is that? We all have. There's a tool that we use in our EDI training called the diversity wheel, and it goes sort of through different circles, and it's like the personal circle is the internal one, is the middle one, then internal, then external, then organizational, then socio-historical. And I think that every single person can look at a diversity wheel and see sort of where there are systemic barriers and factors for them, sort of regardless of where their skin color or what demographic they're part of. And so I think that to assume that you don't have a responsibility to look at diversity, equity, and inclusion it's a misstep, a huge one.
Yeah, and ultimately detrimental to your organization and your staff.
Mhm.
And I mean, and anybody in your life. There was something that you mentioned, and I just I'm thinking about some feedback that I've been seeing lately about EDI, about work in EDI, and even some feedback from an anti-racism story that we had just posted. I'd love to get your opinion on it. We were talking about, or you had just mentioned when you're going through an application process and seeing how the company has broken out different questions in the application process where it actually addresses different groups of people. And I've heard in the past where people will say that they couldn't hire him only because he's Black. We don't want to tokenize him. No one wants to be hired just because they're something.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to articulate or teach that difference of giving someone an opportunity versus, oh, we're picking them to check off a diversity quota.
I think that it feels like a cop out. It feels like a um ridiculous thing to say. And it's been said to me before, like, well, we don't want to tokenize you. First of all, I get to decide. I will decide. So you like that introduces for me more of that like dominance and um more of that power over that exists in racial disparity. Like I'll decide if I think that it's tokenizing or not. I think that, I don't want to be like spending my existence just like calling out white people, but I feel like I'm
Yeah.
tired of white people telling me when I am a token and when
Yes.
I'm not. I
Yeah.
will let you know. A person of color will let you know if it is a scenario where you are making someone a token of something. I think that it's an excuse that people use to stay within the comfort of what they're used to. You are crippling your organization by hiring people that continue to look like you. And that it isn't about things like affirmative action and making sure that you have the representation. It's recognizing that if you want your company to be successful, get some people with differing viewpoints in that space.
Yeah.
And I feel like one of the things that it's something that I've said at NAIT, it's something that I've said in other organizations, we need to be willing to, when we look at hiring people, we need to be able to look at lived experience and examples of that person doing that work. It's not necessarily, when you look at a resume, you don't have to see this person has 20 years of experience doing this same thing. It could be this person has experience with doing something like this. They've only done it for 6 months. Here are examples of how amazing their work is. This is the different voice that they're going to bring to our environment. And you hire them because of those things. It has nothing to do with hiring a person because they are an underrepresented individual. You're hiring them, yeah, they are an underrepresented individual, and you have made a misstep in your organization not having a different voice at the table. And so you're remedying that. And I think that that's the thing that you say. The other stuff feels like an excuse to me. It feels like a way to stick within the status quo and maintain your power.
This is a journey of my own, is how to educate folks about EDI and trying to find that line between offering education, but also just taking on the labor of someone who's unwilling to learn. And for the people who are willing to learn, but they're just not quite there because they're very comfortable with being comfortable. What advice would you give them in terms of how this type of work isn't only benefiting the equity seeking groups, it also benefits themselves and their business.
I think all of the onus is on the individual to educate themselves, but you're absolutely right. There are people who just are not there and are really unwilling to look at it. And I think that it's conversations like this, it's initiatives like the NAIT, equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy, things like that, that open up a dialogue for people. I think that you can't help but notice it when it comes up in places. So, the stories that get posted, or the things that get told, or the groups that get created, or the different underrepresented or equity seeking groups that create space and time on campus. And it's not necessarily to educate others, but it's really to create community for themselves. And they're willing and open to having their conversations and activities open to people who might not necessarily be part of that equity seeking group, but want to learn. I think that, as people of color, as people who are part of equity seeking groups, it's not our responsibility to educate, but it is our responsibility to advocate. Um, and I think that some might disagree with that, but I I will always advocate for myself. That will be my standpoint for probably the rest of my life, and would encourage younger folks, and if I have children, encourage them to advocate for yourself. And so you don't necessarily need to move throughout life educating people, but if you are speaking your truth and talking about your experience, people will hear those things and listen to those things. And it might be overly optimistic to assume that creating space is going to invite people in, but I think that if you create the spaces and make them open, then people might stumble upon them or be invited by someone else, or things that I have found really interesting. Like I was telling the story about my partners, to share with people resources that I find useful, YouTube videos that I've watched, a podcast that I've listened to, posting it on, social media and things like that. And people see it and they might be intrigued by it and they might not, but it might trigger for them to come back to it. They might recognize it or remember it.
Yep.
One sort of, I guess, caveat that I would put on that is something that I'm learning for myself is recognizing when it's too much, and recognizing when I'm taking on more educating than I need to, and knowing how what depleted feels like in that space. Because I think that as people of color, and as people who are in underrepresented or equity deserving groups, you can feel tired so quickly. You can feel beat down so quickly. Sorry. You can feel like you are climbing up an uphill battle continuously without any sort of reprieve. But it's recognizing and knowing those moments, and knowing when to take a pause, but also knowing the importance of having your voice be heard, and what it will do for you as an individual, but also for your community around you.
Thank you for sharing that.
Mm.
For people who are encouraged to talk about their experiences, or to have those uncomfortable conversations, but I very rarely take them up on that offer, because I don't actually trust that what I have to say will be well received. And I'm wondering, on both sides, what you would advise not just grads and students, but everyone in their careers, how they can feel more comfortable having those conversations and push through that discomfort, possibly the other person's discomfort. But on the flip side, what actions should the other side be, the people who have offered to say, oh, please come talk to me about this? What are actions that they could do to actually foster that trust?
I feel like in a work environment, I think that um, having structure around those conversations, if that makes any sense. So,
Mhm.
creating a space. So making space and making time for those conversations, I think that to sort of wait for them to come up organically, or to wait for the person who is feeling discomfort or feeling like they need to surface something that's been happening, and putting the onus on them to have to go to you to say, I'm uncomfortable, I think is not, that's less than ideal. And I think that it likely won't happen. So I think that if you want to have that trust and have that space, then be intentional with that space. So creating that space within a team. When I think of I've been in leadership positions before, or various different organizations and things like that, and it's like creating time for conversation and framing it and saying, this is a conversation that we're going to have that might have discomfort, like moments of discomfort, but let's set some ground rules. All emotions are valid. This isn't about guilt or blame or anything of that variety. It's about sharing experiences and creating understanding. And, not to say that those are the only spaces that a person should feel safe and can feel like they can bring those things up. But I think that making them intentional to begin with, like, paves the way for them to be commonplace going forward. And I think even in a family setting, when I think about my family, so my sister and I are both married interracially, so we have a lot of discussions as a family about race and race relations and feminism and things like that. And I think that we just have, the dinner table is often the place where those conversations happen. And so, sort of regardless of kind of whether you're in a formal work setting where you want to create a meeting that happens once every 6 weeks or something like that, where conversations happen and whoever wants to attend can attend. I think in a family setting, in a friend setting, you can start to create those opportunities and spaces. I think for folks who are in a dominant place, initiating those conversations with, I was in this moment, and what I'm wondering is how do I handle it? What does it mean? And like I was saying before, you have the, as a underrepresented individual or marginalized individual, you have the opportunity to say, here's a book, go and read it, or
Yeah.
this has been my personal experience. So I
Mhm.
think that was a long-winded way of saying, I think we need to be intentional about creating trusting spaces. There's a lot of commentary on the term safe spaces and how it sort of further, like, kind of dominates and creates kind of power dynamics and things like that. But I like a variation that I heard recently on brave spaces. So creating space where people can be brave and speak with boldness, but also respect and kindness. And I think that laying out those as values and foundations at this outset are also important.
Just because I know we're near the end here, could you talk a little bit about how NAIT is developing and actioning the EDI strategy?
So one of the things that is an important add-on to the EDI strategy is the EDI lens. And this was a tool, I guess I will say. The EDI lens is a tool that people can use to look at their work with through the lens of EDI. And it's various different types of work. And so I think that that's one of the ways that um, NAIT is really taking steps towards implementing the EDI strategy. The lens training that we're doing, I think there's 4 upcoming, and there are general training sessions for all NAIT staff, so they can attend them. Um, at any one of those, they were able to attend, and I facilitate as the primary facilitator, and then I will do some co-facilitations with my colleague Tim Ira. So that's one step that NAIT's taking. There are a few other exploratory things that we're looking at. An EDI advisory committee. We're just kind of exploring what that looks like in other organizations and other institutions, and what something like that could look like at NAIT. That type of advisory or committee spends a lot of time working with the EDI strategy and working with something like the lens to incorporate it into all sorts of initiatives and new proposals and things like that. So I think that that would be another way. And then one of the other projects that I'm working on is the departmental action plans. So working with departments to look at how they can take EDI strategy and the EDI lens and implement it into into their day to day and what makes sense for their areas of work. And using, the framework that's already been created through that was talked about through the lens, advancing equity, building a diverse community, and cultivating an inclusive community. So using those sort of three strong pillars as ways that departments can look at how their work and the initiatives that they have planned can fit into those things. So those are a few of the bigger projects that I'm working on that I'm excited about. So yeah.
That's wonderful. As a close, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you'd like to talk about? Any last thoughts that you want to share?
I would say, one of the things that keeps sort of ringing in my mind is that um, we need to advocate for ourselves. We need to be champions for ourselves. We need to see our own excellence, but not to the point of feeling like we are, waking up every day and putting on boxing gloves to go to work, but to celebrate who we are and to recognize that um, I I deserve it. I deserve to be in the spaces that I'm in. Um, I deserve success, and I think that any historically um, underrepresented individual, I think, needs to recognize that they are valuable and they are an integral part of any organization or team or thing that they're part of. And so I feel lucky and I feel blessed and I feel honored to be to have my Black excellence celebrated for Black History Month, but all the time. And I think that we should be celebrating our differences and celebrating the things that make us who we are.
Well, that's wonderful, especially when you said, I deserve this and you do. And it makes me sad that you have to question that in the first place,
Yeah.
you know? Thank you for sharing with me today.
Thank you so much. This was such a great conversation, Joyce.
I'm glad.
Thanks again to Rondah Worrell-Maik for joining us today. Thank you to Nicole Graham and Scott Messenger for co-producing, and thank you to Rory Lee for the artwork. And thank you for listening. In the episode show notes, you'll find a Tech Life Today article about how to continue your work on anti-racism. You'll also find a link to NAIT's EDI strategy. If you like what you heard, don't forget to tap the like button, and see you next time on Career Essentials.